Chapter 18, Part 1 of Piping Hot, Bouille, by Émile Zola, translated by Henry Visitelli. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Mark Leader. Chapter 18, Part 1 of Piping Hot. In December, the 8th month of her mourning, Madame Josselin for the first time accepted an invitation to dine out. It was merely at the Duverriers', almost a family gathering, with which Clotilde opened her Saturday receptions of the new winter. The day before, Adèle had been told that she would have to help Julie with the washing up. The ladies were in the habit of thus lending their servants to each other on the days when they gave parties. "And above all, try and put a little more go into yourself," said Madame Josselin to her maid-of-all-work. "I don't know what you've got in your body now. You're as limp as rags, yet you're fat and plump." Adèle was simply 9 months gone in the family way. For a long time she had thought she was merely growing stouter, which greatly surprised her, however, and she would get into a perfect rage with her ever-hungry, empty stomach on the days when Madame triumphantly showed her to her guests. Ah, well, those who accused her of weighing her servants' bread might come and look at that great glutton. It was not likely she got so fat by merely licking the walls. When, in her stupidity, Adèle at length became aware of her misfortune, she restrained herself 20 times from telling the truth to her mistress, who was really taking advantage of her condition to make the neighborhood think that she was at length feeding her. But from this moment, terror stultified her entirely. Her village ideas once more took possession of her obtuse skull. She thought herself damned. She fancied that the gendarme would come and take her if she admitted her pregnancy. Then all her low cunning was made use of to hide it. She concealed the feelings of sickness. Twice she thought she would drop down dead before her kitchen fire, whilst stirring some sauces. The pain that she had endured for the 2 last months with the obstinacy of a heroic silence was indeed frightful. Adèle went up to bed that night about 11 o'clock. The thought of tomorrow evening terrified her. More drudgery, more bullying by Julie, and she could scarcely move about. During the night she was seized with labor pains, and a desire came over her to move about, so as to walk them off. She therefore lighted the candle and began to wander round the room, her tongue dried up, tormented with a burning thirst, and her cheeks on fire. Hours passed in this cruel wandering, without her daring to put on her shoes for fear of making a noise, whilst she was only protected against the cold by an old shawl thrown across her shoulders. 2 o'clock struck, then 3 o'clock. Not a soul stirred in the adjoining rooms. Everyone was snoring. She could hear Julie's sonorous hum, whilst Lisa made a kind of hissing noise like the shrill notes of a fife. 4 o'clock had just struck, when, seized with a violent pain, she felt that the end was approaching and could not restrain uttering a loud cry. At this, the occupants of the other rooms began to rouse up. Voices thick with sleep were heard saying, "Well, what? Who's being murdered?" "Someone's being taken by force." "Don't dream out loud like that." Dreadfully frightened, she drew the bedclothes over the newborn child, which was uttering plaintive cries like a little kitten. But she soon heard Julie snoring again after turning over, whilst Lisa, once more asleep, no longer uttered a sound. Then she experienced an immense relief, an infinite comfort of calm and repose, and lay as one dead. She must have dozed thus for the best part of an hour. When 6 o'clock struck, the consciousness of her position awoke her again. Time was flying. She rose up painfully and did whatever things came into her head, without deciding on them beforehand. A frosty moon shone full into the room. After dressing herself, she wrapped the infant up in some old rags, and then folded a couple of newspapers around it. It uttered no cry now, yet its little heart was beating. Not one of the servants was about as yet, and after getting slumbering Monsieur Gould to unfasten the door from his room, she was able to go out and lay her bundle in the Passage Choiseul, the gates of which had just been opened, and then quietly returned upstairs. She met no one. For once in her lifetime, luck was on her side. She immediately set about tidying her room, after which, utterly worn out and as white as wax, she again lay down. It was thus that Madame Josserand found her when she had made up her mind to go upstairs toward 9 o'clock, greatly surprised at not seeing Adele come down. The servant having complained of a violent attack of diarrhea which had kept her awake all night, Madame exclaimed, "Of course, you must have eaten too much again. You think of nothing else but stuffing yourself." The girl's paleness, however, made her uneasy, and she talked of sending for the doctor, but she was glad to save the 3 francs when Adele vowed that she merely needed rest. Since her husband's death, Madame Josserand had been living with her daughter Hortense, on an allowance made her by the brothers Bernheim, but which did not prevent her from bitterly alluding to them as persons who lived on the brains of others, and she spent less than ever on food, so as not to descend to a lower level of society by quitting her apartments and giving up her Tuesday receptions. "That's right, sleep," said she. "There's some cold beef left which will do for this morning, and tonight we will dine out. If you cannot come down to help Julie, she will have to do without you." The dinner that evening at the Duverrier's was a very cordial one. All the family was there, the 2 Vabres and their wives, Madame Josserand, Hortense, Léon, and even Uncle Bachelard, who behaved well. Moreover, they had invited Troublot to fill a vacant place, and Madame d'Amberville, so as not to separate her from Léon. The latter, after his marriage with the niece, had once again fallen into the arms of the aunt, who was still necessary to him. They were seen to arrive together in all the drawing-rooms, and they would apologize for the young wife, whom a cold or a feeling of idleness, said they, kept at home. That evening the whole table complained of scarce knowing her. They loved her so much, she was so beautiful. Then they talked of the chorus which Clotilde was to give at the end of the evening. It was the blessing of the daggers again, but this time with 5 tenors, something complete and magisterial. For 2 months past, Duverrier himself, who had become quite charming, had been looking up the friends of the house and saying to everyone he met, "You're quite a stranger. Come and see us. My wife is going to give her choruses again." Therefore, half through the dinner, they talked of nothing but music. The happiest good nature and the most free-hearted gaiety prevailed throughout. Then, after the coffee, and whilst the ladies sat round the drawing-room fire, the gentlemen formed a group in the parlour and began to exchange some grave ideas. The other guests were now arriving, and among the earliest were Campardon, Abbé Mauduit, and Doctor Juillat, without including the diners, with the exception of Troublot, who had disappeared on leaving the table. They almost immediately commenced talking politics. The debates in the chamber deeply interested the gentlemen, and they had not yet given over discussing the success of the opposition candidates for Paris, all of whom had been returned at the May elections. This triumph of a dissatisfied portion of the middle classes made them feel anxious at heart, in spite of their apparent delight. "Dear me," declared Léon, "Monsieur Thiers is certainly a most talented man, but he puts so much acrimony into his speeches on the Mexican expedition that he quite spoils their effect." He had just been named to a higher appointment through Madame d'Amberville's influence, and had at once joined the government party. The only thing that remained in him of the famished demagogue was an unbearable intolerance of all doctrines. "Not long ago you were accusing the government of every sin," said the doctor, smiling. "I hope you at least voted for Monsieur Thiers." The young man avoided answering. Théophile, whose stomach was no longer able to digest his food, and who was worried with fresh doubts as to his wife's constancy, exclaimed, "I voted for him. When men refuse to live as brothers, so much the worse for them." "And so much the worse for you as well, eh?" remarked Duverrier, who, speaking but little, uttered some very profound observations. Théophile, greatly scared, looked at him. Auguste no longer dared admit that he also voted for Monsieur Thiers. Then every one was very much surprised to hear Uncle Bachelard utter a legitimate profession of faith. He thought it the most genteel. Campardon seconded him warmly. He had abstained from voting himself because the official candidate, Monsieur Derwink, did not offer sufficient guarantees as regards religion, and he furiously declaimed against Renan's Life of Jesus, which had recently made its appearance. "It is not the book that should be burnt. It is the author," repeated he. "You are perhaps too radical, my friend," interrupted the priest in a conciliatory tone. "But, indeed, the symptoms are becoming terrible. There's some talk of driving away the Pope. The revolution has invaded Parliament. We're walking on the edge of a precipice." "So much the better," said Dr. Juillerhat simply. Then the others all protested. He renewed his attacks against the middle classes, prophesying that there would be a clean sweep the day when the masses wished to enjoy power in their turn, and the others loudly interrupted him, exclaiming that the middle classes represented the virtue, the industry, and the thrift of a nation. Duveyrier was at length able to make himself heard. He owned it before all. He had voted for Monsieur de Wink, not that Monsieur de Wink exactly represented his opinions, but because he was the symbol of order. Yes, the Saturnalia of the Reign of Terror might one day return. Monsieur Rouet, that remarkable statesman who had just succeeded Monsieur Biot, had formerly prophesied it in the chamber. He concluded with these striking words: "The triumph of the opposition is the preliminary subsidence of the structure. Take care that it does not crush you in falling." The other gentlemen held their peace, with the unavowed fear of having allowed themselves to be carried away even to compromising their personal safety. They beheld workmen begrimed with powder and blood entering their homes, violating their maidservants and drinking their wine. No doubt the emperor deserved a lesson, only they were beginning to regret having given him so severe a one. "Be easy," concluded the doctor scoffingly. "We will manage to save you from the bullets." But he was going too far. They set him down as an original. It was, moreover, thanks to this reputation for originality that he did not lose his connection. He continued by resuming with Abbé Maudoui their eternal quarrel respecting the approaching downfall of the church. Léon now sided with the priest. He talked of Providence, and on Sundays accompanied Madame d'Ambreville to 9 o'clock Mass. Meanwhile, the guests continued to arrive. The drawing-room was becoming quite filled with ladies. Valérie and Berthe were exchanging little secrets like two good friends. The other Madame Campardon, whom the architect had brought no doubt in place of poor Rose, who was already in bed upstairs and reading Dickens, was giving Madame Josserand an economical recipe for washing clothes without soap, whilst Hortense, seated all by herself and expecting Verdier, did not take her eyes off the door. But suddenly Clotilde, while conversing with Madame d'Ambreville, rose up and held out her hands. Her friend, Madame Octave Mouret, had just entered the room. The marriage had taken place early in November, at the end of her mourning. "And your husband?" asked the hostess. "He's not going to disappoint me, I hope." "No, no," answered Caroline, with a smile. "He will be here directly. Something detained him at the last moment." There was some whispering. Glances full of curiosity were directed toward her, so calm and so lovely, ever the same, with the pleasant assurance of a woman who succeeds in everything she undertakes. Madame Josserand pressed her hand, as though she were delighted to see her again. Berthe and Valérie left off talking and examined her at their ease, studying her costume, a straw-colored dress covered with lace. But in the midst of his quiet forgetfulness of the past, Auguste, whom the political discussion had left quite cool, was giving signs of indignant amazement as he stood near the parlor door. What? His sister was going to receive the family of his wife's former lover? And in his marital rancor there was a touch of the jealous anger of a tradesman ruined by a triumphant competition. For the Ladies' Paradise, by extending its business and creating a special department for silk, had so drained his resources that he'd been obliged to take a partner. He drew near, and whilst everyone was making much of Madame Mouret, he whispered to Clotilde, "You know, I will never put up with it." "Put up with what?" asked she, greatly surprised. I do not mind the wife so much. She's not done me any harm. But if the husband comes, I shall take hold of Bertha by the arm and leave the room in the presence of everybody." She looked at him and then shrugged her shoulders. Caroline was her oldest friend. She was certainly not going to give up seeing her just to satisfy his caprices. As though anyone even recollected the matter. He would do far better not to rake up things forgotten by everybody but himself. And as, deeply affected, he looked to Bertha for support, expecting that she would get up and follow him at once, she calmed him with a frown. Was he mad? Did he wish to make himself more ridiculous than he had ever been before? "But it is in order that I may not appear ridiculous," replied he in despair. Then Madame Josserand inclined toward him, and said in a severe tone of voice, "It is becoming quite indecent. Everyone is looking at you. Do behave yourself for once in a way." He held his tongue, but without submitting. From this moment a certain uneasiness existed among the ladies. The only one who preserved her smiling tranquillity was Madame Mouret, now sitting beside Clotilde and opposite Bertha. They watched Auguste, who had retired to the window recess where his marriage had been decided not so very long before. His anger was bringing on a headache, and he now and again pressed his forehead against the icy cold panes. Octave did not arrive till very late. As he reached the landing, he met Madame Jusseur, who had just come down, wrapped in a shawl. She complained of her chest, and had got up on purpose not to disappoint the Duveyriers. Her languid state did not prevent her falling into the young man's arms, as she congratulated him on his marriage. "How delighted I am with such a splendid result, my friend! Really, I was quite in despair about you. I never thought you would have succeeded. Tell me, you rascal, how did you manage to get over her?" Octave smiled and kissed her fingers. But someone who was bounding upstairs with the agility of a goat disturbed them, and greatly surprised, they fancied they recognized Saturnin. It was indeed Saturnin, who a week before had left the Asile des Molineaux, where for a second time Dr. Chassin declined to detain him any longer, still considering him not sufficiently mad. No doubt he was going to spend the evening with Marie Pichon, just as in former days, when his parents had company. And those bygone times were suddenly evoked. Octave could hear an expiring voice coming from above, singing the ballad with which Marie whiled away her vacant hours. He beheld her once more eternally alone beside the crib in which Lilith slumbered, and awaiting Jules' return with all the complacency of a gentle and useless woman. "I wish you every happiness with your wife," repeated Madame Jusseur, tenderly squeezing Octave's hands. In order not to enter the drawing-room with her, he was purposely occupying some time in removing his overcoat, when Troublot, in his dress clothes, bareheaded, and looking quite upset, came from the passage leading to the kitchen. "You know, she's not at all well," murmured he, whilst Hippolyte announced Madame Jusseur. "Who isn't?" asked Octave. "Why, Adèle, the servant upstairs." Hearing there was something the matter with her, he'd gone up quite paternally on leaving the dinner-table. It must have been a very severe attack of cholera. A good glass of mulled wine was what she ought to have, and she had not even a lump of sugar. Then, as he noticed that his friend smiled in an indifferent sort of way, he added, "Hullo, I forgot you're married, you joker. This sort of thing no longer interests you. I never thought of that when I found you with Madame. Anything you like except that." They entered together. The ladies were just then speaking of their servants, and were taking such interest in the conversation that they did not notice them at first. All were complacently approving Madame Duveyrier, who was trying to explain, in an embarrassed way, why she continued to keep Clémence and Hippolyte. He was rough, but she dressed her so well that one could not help shutting one's eyes to other matters. Neither Valérie nor Bertha could succeed in securing a decent girl. They'd given it up in despair after trying every registry office, the good-for-nothing servants from which had done no more than pass through their kitchen. Madame Josserand violently abused Adele, of whom she related some fresh abominable and stupid doings of extraordinary character, and yet she did not send her about her business. As for the other Madame Campardon, she was quite enthusiastic in her praises of Lisa. A pearl, not a thing to reproach her with. In short, one of those deserving domestics to whom one gives prizes. "She is quite one of the family now," said she. "Our little Angèle is attending some lectures at the Hôtel de Ville, and Lisa accompanies her. Oh, they might remain out together for days. She should not be in the least anxious." It was at this moment that the ladies caught sight of Octave. He was advancing to wish Clotilde good evening. Bertha looked at him, then without the least affectation she resumed her conversation with Valérie, who had exchanged with him the affectionate glance of disinterested friendship. The others, Madame Josserand, Madame d'Ambreville, without throwing themselves at him, surveyed him with sympathetic interest. "So here you are at last," said Clotilde, who was most amiable. "I was beginning to tremble for the chorus." And as Madame Mouret gently scolded her husband for being so late, he made some excuses. "But, my dear, I was unable to come sooner. I am most sorry, madame. However, I am now entirely at your disposal." Meanwhile, the ladies were anxiously watching the window recess into which Auguste had retired. They received a momentary fright when they beheld him turn round at the sound of Octave's voice. His headache was no doubt worse. He had a restless look about the eyes, which seemed full of a darkness of the street. He at length appeared to make up his mind, and, returning to his former position beside his sister's chair, he said, "Send them away, or else we will leave." Clotilde again shrugged her shoulders. Then Auguste seemed disposed to give her time to consider. He would wait a few minutes longer, more especially as Troublot had taken Octave into the parlour. The other ladies were still uneasy, for they had heard the husband whisper in his wife's ear, "If he comes back here, you must get up and follow me. Otherwise, you may return to your mother's." In the parlour, the gentlemen greeted Octave quite as cordially. If Léon made a point of showing a little coolness, Uncle Bachelard and even Théophile seemed to declare, as they held out their hands to Octave, that the family forgot everything. He congratulated Campardon, who, decorated 2 days previously, now wore a broad red ribbon, and the beaming architect scolded him for never calling now and then to pass an hour with his wife. Though one got married, it was scarcely nice to forget friends of 15 years' standing. But the young man felt quite surprised and anxious as he stood before Duveyrier. He had not seen him since his recovery. He looked uneasily at his jaw, all out of place, dropping too much on the left side, and which now gave a horrid squinting expression to his countenance. Then, when the counsellor spoke, he had another surprise. His voice had lowered 2 tones. It had become quite sepulchral. This ends Chapter 18, Part 1 of Piping Hot. Chapter 18, Part 2 of Piping Hot, Bouille, by Émile Zola, translated by Henry Visitelli. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Mark Leader. Chapter 18, Part 2 of Piping Hot. "Don't you think him much better thus?" said Troublot to Octave, as they returned to the drawing-room door. "It positively gives him a certain majestic air. I saw him presiding at the assizes the day before yesterday. Listen, they're talking of it." And indeed the gentleman had abandoned politics to take up morality. They were listening to Duveyrier as he gave some details of an affair in which his attitude had been particularly noticed. He was even about to be named a president and an officer of a Legion of Honor. It was respecting an infanticide already a year old. The unnatural mother, a regular savage, as he said, happened to be the boot-stitcher, his former tenant, that tall, pale, and friendless girl whose pregnant condition had roused Monsieur Gours's indignation so much. And besides that, she was altogether stupid, for without reflecting that her appearance would betray her, she'd gone and cut her child in two and kept it at the bottom of a bonnet box. She'd naturally told the jury quite a ridiculous romance, a seducer who had deserted her, misery, hunger, and then a fit of mad despair on seeing herself unable to supply the little one's wants. In a word, the same story they all told. But it was necessary to make an example. Duveyrier congratulated himself on having summed up with that lucidity which often decided a jury's verdict. "And what was your sentence?" asked the doctor. 5 years, replied the counselor in his new voice, which seemed both hoarse and sepulchral. "It is time to oppose a dyke to the debauchery which threatens to submerge Paris." Troublot nudged Octave's elbow. They were both acquainted with the facts of the attempt at suicide. "Eh? You hear him?" murmured he. "Without joking, it improves his voice. It stirs one more, does it not? It goes straight to the heart now. Ah, if you had only seen him, standing up, draped in his long red robes, with his mug all askew. On my word, he quite frightened me. He was extraordinary. Oh, you know, a style in his majesty enough to make your flesh creep." But he left off speaking and listened to the ladies in the drawing-room, who were again on the subject of servants. That very morning Madame Duveyrier had given Julie a week's notice. She had nothing certainly to say against the girl's cooking, only good behavior came before everything in her eyes. The truth was that, warned by Dr. Juillerat, and anxious for the health of her son, whose little goings-on she tolerated at home, so as to keep them under control, she had had an explanation with Julie, who had been unwell for some time past, and the latter, like a genteel cook, whose style was not to quarrel with her employers, had accepted her week's notice. Madame Josserand at once shared Clotilde's indignation. Yes, one should be very strict on the question of morality. For instance, if she kept that slut Adèle in spite of her dirty ways and her stupidity, it was because the girl was virtuous. Oh, on that point she had nothing whatever to reproach her with. "Poor Adèle, when one only thinks," murmured Troublot, again affected at the thought of the wretched creature, half frozen upstairs beneath her thin blanket. Then, bending toward Octave's ear, he added with a chuckle, "I say, Duveyrier might at least take her up a bottle of claret." "Yes, gentlemen," the counselor was continuing, "statistics will bear me out. The crime of infanticide is increasing in the most frightful proportions. Sentiment prevails to too great an extent in the present day, and far too much consideration is shown to science, to your pretended physiology, all of which will end by there soon being neither good nor evil. One cannot cure debauchery. The thing is to destroy it at its root." This refutation was addressed above all to Dr. Juillerat, who had wished to give a medical explanation of the boot-stitcher's case. The other gentlemen also exhibited great severity and disgust. Campardon could not understand vice. Uncle Bachelard defended infancy. Théophile demanded an inquiry. Léon discussed the question of prostitution in its relation with the state, whilst Troublot, in answer to an inquiry of Octave's, talked of Duverrier's new mistress, who was a decent sort of a woman this time, rather mature, but romantic, with a soul expanded by that ideal which the counselor required to purify love. In short, a worthy person who gave him a peaceful home, imposing upon him as much as she liked, and sleeping with his friends, without making any unnecessary fuss. And the Abbé Mauduit alone remained silent, his eyes fixed on the ground, his mind sorely troubled, and full of an infinite sadness. They were now about to sing the Blessing of the Daggers. The drawing-room had filled up, a flood of rich dresses was crushing in the brilliant light from the chandelier and the lamps, whilst gay bursts of laughter ran along the rows of chairs. And in the midst of the buzz, Clotilde in a low voice roughly chided Auguste, who, on seeing Octave enter with the other gentlemen of the chorus, had caught hold of Bertha's arm to make her leave her seat. But he was already beginning to yield, feeling more and more embarrassed in the presence of the lady's dumb disapproval, whilst his head had become entirely the prey of triumphant neuralgia. Madame d'Amberville's stern looks quite drove him to despair, and even the other Madame Campardon was against him. It was reserved to Madame Josserand to finish him off. She abruptly interfered, threatening to take back her daughter and never to pay him the 50,000 francs dowry, for she was always promising this dowry with the greatest coolness imaginable. Then, turning toward Uncle Bachelard, seated behind her, and next to Madame Jusseur, she made him renew his promises. The uncle placed his hand on his heart. He knew his duty, the family before everything. Auguste, repulsed on all sides, beat a retreat, and again sought refuge in the window recess, where he once more pressed his burning forehead against the icy cold panes. Then Octave experienced a singular sensation, as though his Paris life was beginning over again. It was as though the 2 years he had lived in the Rue de Choiseul had been a blank. His wife was there, smiling at him, and yet nothing seemed to have passed in his existence. Today was the same as yesterday. There was neither pause nor ending. Troublot showed him the new partner standing beside Berthe, a little fair fellow, very neat in his ways, who gave her, it was said, no end of presents. Uncle Bachelard, who was now going in for poetry, was revealing himself in a sentimental light to Madame Jusseur, whom he quite affected with some intimate details respecting Fifi and Guerlain. Théophile, devoured by doubts, doubled up by violent fits of coughing, was imploring Dr. Juillerat in an out-of-the-way corner to give his wife something to quiet her. Campardon, his eyes fixed on Cousin Gasperine, was talking of the Diocese of Evreux, and jumping from that to the great works of the new Rue de 10 Décembre, defending God and art, sending the world about its business, for at heart he did not care a hang for it. He was an artist. And behind a flower stand there could even be seen the back of a gentleman, whom all the marriageable girls contemplated with an air of profound curiosity. It was Verdier who was talking with Hortense, the pair of them having an acrimonious explanation, again putting off their marriage till the spring, so as not to turn the woman and her child into the street in the depth of winter. Then the chorus was sung afresh. The architect, with his mouth wide open, gave out the first line. Clotilde struck a chord and uttered her cry. And the other voices burst forth. The uproar increased little by little, and spread with a violence that scared the candles and caused the ladies to turn pale. Troublot, having been found wanting among the basses, was being tried a second time as a baritone. The 5 tenors were much noticed, Octave especially, to whom Clotilde regretted being unable to give a solo. When the voices fell, and she had applied the soft pedal, imitating the cadenced and distant footsteps of a departing patrol, the applause was deafening, and she, together with the gentlemen, had every praise showered upon them. And at the farthest end of the adjoining room, right behind a triple row of men in evening dress, one beheld Duveyrier clenching his teeth so as not to cry aloud with anguish, with his mouth all on one side and his festering eruptions almost bleeding. Petit, coming next, unrolled the same procession, distributed the same cups and the same sandwiches. For a moment the Abbé Mauduit found himself once more in the middle of the deserted drawing-room. He looked through the wide-open door on the crush of guests, and, vanquished, he smiled. He again cast the mantle of religion over this corrupt middle-class society, like a master in the ceremonies draping the canker, to stave off the final decomposition. He must save the church, as heaven had not answered his cry of misery and despair. At length, the same as on every Saturday, when midnight struck, the guests began to withdraw. Campardon was among the first to leave, with the other Madame Campardon. Léon and Madame d'Ambreville were not long in maritally following them. Verdier's back had long ago disappeared, when Madame Josserand went off with Hortense, bullying her for what she called her romantic obstinacy. Uncle Bachelard, very drunk from the punch he had taken, detained Madame Jusseur a moment at the door, finding her advice full of experience quite refreshing. Troublot, who had stolen some sugar for Adèle, was making for the passage leading to the kitchen, when the presence of Berthe and Auguste in the anteroom embarrassed him, and he pretended to be looking for his hat. But just at this minute, Octave and his wife, escorted by Clotilde, also came out and asked for their wraps. There ensued a few seconds of embarrassment. The anteroom was not large. Berthe and Madame Mouret were pressed against each other, whilst Hippolyte was searching for their things. They both smiled. Then, when the door was opened, the two men, Octave and Auguste, brought face to face, did the polite, each stepping aside. At length Berthe consented to pass out first after an exchange of bows, and Valérie, who was leaving in her turn with Théophile, again looked at Octave in the affectionate way of a disinterested friend. He and she alone might have told each other everything. "Goodbye," repeated Clotilde graciously to the two families, before returning to the drawing-room. Octave stopped short. He had just caught sight on the next floor of the partner, the neat little fair fellow, taking his departure like the rest, and whose hand Saturnin, who had just left Marie, was pressing in an outburst of savage tenderness, stuttering the while, "Friend, friend, friend." A singular feeling of jealousy at first darted through him. Then he smiled. It was the past, and he again recalled his amours, all his campaign of Paris, the complacencies of that good little Pichon, the repulse he received from Valérie, of whom he preserved a pleasant recollection, his stupid connection with Berthe, which he regretted as pure waste of time. Now he had transacted his business, Paris was conquered, and he gallantly followed her whom in his heart he still styled Madame Edouin, every now and then stooping to see that the train of her dress did not catch in the stair-rods. The house had once more resumed its grand air of middle-class dignity. He fancied he could hear Marie's distant and expiring ballad. Beneath the porch he met Jules coming in. Madame Guillaume was at death's door and refused to see her daughter. Then that was all. The doctor and the priest retired last, and still arguing. Troublot had shyly gone up to Adèle to attend to her, and the deserted staircase slumbered in a heavy warmth, with its chaste doors enclosing respectable alcoves. 1 o'clock was striking, when Monsieur Gourde, whom Madame Gourde was snugly awaiting in bed, turned out the gas. Then the whole house lapsed into silent darkness, as though annihilated by the decency of its sleep. Nothing remained. Life resumed its level of indifference and stupidity. On the following morning, Adèle dragged herself down to her kitchen so as to allay suspicion. A thaw had set in during the night, and she opened the window, feeling stifled, when Hippolyte's voice rose furiously from the depths of a narrow courtyard. "You dirty hussies! Who's been emptying her slops out of the window again? Madame's dress is quite spoilt." He'd hung out one of Madame Duverrier's dresses given him to brush, and he found it all spattered with sour broth. Then, from the top to the bottom, the servants appeared at their windows and violently exculpated themselves. The sluice was open, and a rush of the most abominable words flowed from the foul spot. In times of thaw, the walls were steeped with humidity, and quite a pestilence ascended from the obscure little courtyard, all the hidden corruptions of the different floors seeming to melt and ooze out by this common sewer of the house. "It wasn't me," said Adèle, leaning out. "I've only just come." Lisa abruptly raised her head. "Hullo, so you're on your legs again? Well, what was the matter? Is it true you almost croaked?" "Oh, yes, I had such colics, and not at all funny, I can tell you." This put a stop to the quarrel. Valérie and Berthe's new servants, a big camel and a little jade, as they were termed, looked curiously at Adèle's pale face. Victoire and Julie also wished to see her, and stretched their necks and leant their heads back. They all had an idea that there was something wrong, for it was unnatural to have such gripes and yell out as she did. "Perhaps you've had something which didn't agree with you," said Lisa. The others burst out laughing. Another rush of foul language overflowed, whilst the wretched creature, awfully frightened, stammered, Hold your tongues, with your nasty words. I'm quite ill enough as it is. You don't want to finish me off, do you?" No, of course not. She was as stupid could be, and dirty enough to disgust the whole neighborhood, but they all held too closely together to bring her into any trouble. And they naturally turned to abusing their masters and mistresses. They criticized the party of the previous evening with looks of profound repugnance.
"So they've all made it up again now?"
asked Victoire, as she sipped her glass of syrup and brandy. Hippolyte, who was wiping Madame's dress, replied, "They've no more heart than my shoes. When they've spat in one another's faces, they wash themselves with it, to make one believe they're clean."
"They must manage to agree somehow or other," said Lisa. "Otherwise it wouldn't take long before our turn came."
But there was a moment of panic. A door opened, and the servants were already diving back into their kitchens. When Lisa announced that it was only little Angèle, there was nothing to fear with her. She understood. And from the foul spout there again arose all the rancor of the domestics, in the midst of the poisonous stench caused by the thaw. There was a grand spreading out of all the dirty linen of the last 2 years. It was quite consoling not to be ladies and gentlemen when one beheld the masters and mistresses living in the midst of it all, and apparently enjoying it, as they were preparing to go through it all again.
I say, you, up there!" suddenly shouted Victoire. "Was it with Mug Askew that you had what didn't agree with you?"
At this, a ferocious yell of delight quite shook the stinking cesspool. Hippolyte actually tore Madame's dress. But he did not care. It was far too good for her as it was. The big camel and the little jade were bent over the handrails of their windows, wriggling in a mad burst of laughter. Adele, however, who was quite scared, and who was half asleep through weakness, started, and she retorted in the midst of the jeers, "You're all of you heartless things. When you're dying, I'll come and dance at your bedsides."
"Ah, mademoiselle," resumed Lisa,
leaning out to speak to Julie,
"how happy you must feel at leaving such a wretched house in a week. On my word, one becomes wicked here in spite of oneself. I wish you a better home in your next place."
Julie, her arms bare, and dripping with the blood from a turbot she had been just cleaning for that evening's dinner, returned to the window beside the footman. She shrugged her shoulders, and concluded with this philosophical reply.
"Dear me, mademoiselle, here or there, they're all alike. In the present day, whoever has been in the one has been in the other. It's all filth and company."
This ends Chapter 18, Part 2 of Piping Hot. This ends Piping Hot, Pope Bouille, by Émile Zola, translated by Henry Visitelli.